The night Sylvie Marchand walked into her own anniversary dinner, to find her husband sitting with his hand resting on another woman's knee. She didn't scream. She didn't throw her glass. She stood in the doorway of the private dining room at Maison Laurent, the restaurant where she and Garrett had celebrated every year for 12 years, and she simply looked at him. Just looked, and then she placed her clutch on the nearest empty chair, excused herself to use the powder room, and cried alone in a marble bathroom until her hands stopped shaking. Nobody saw her do that part. That part was hers alone. What they did see, Garrett's mother, his uncle Raymond, his cousins Blythe and Spencer, and the woman herself, whose name Sylvie would not learn until later, was Sylvie Marchand, return to that table, sit down across from her husband of 12 years, and spend the next 45 minutes being perfect, devastatingly composed. She asked after Raymond's back surgery. She complimented Blythe on her earrings. She ate half her salmon and drank one glass of wine, and she smiled at exactly the right moments. And when the woman, Claudette, she heard someone murmur, laughed a little too loudly at something Garrett said, Sylvie set down her fork, dabbed her mouth with her napkin, and stood. She did not raise her voice. She did not look at Claudette at all, actually, because Claudette wasn't the one who had made a promise. She looked at Garrett, only at Garrett. "Thank you for dinner," she said. "I hope everyone has a lovely evening." And she walked out. She would think about that moment for a long time afterward, the specific quality of the silence she left behind her. Not the stunned kind, not the guilty kind, the kind that happens when people realize, all at once, that something has irrevocably ended, and they weren't prepared for it, and it is entirely their own fault. Sylvie had grown up in Sudbury, the daughter of a woman who cleaned offices and a father who drove long haul and was home maybe 6 weeks out of every year. She had put herself through school at Western, waitressing on weekends and tutoring chemistry on weeknights. And she'd graduated with a business degree and a ferocious, quiet hunger that she didn't quite have words for yet. She knew only that she was going somewhere, and that she was going to get there herself. She met Garrett Whitmore at 26. He was tall and easy in the way of men who had never doubted whether there was a place for them in the world. He laughed readily. He smelled good. He introduced himself at a fundraiser for the hospital foundation, where she'd just taken a junior position in development, and by the end of the evening he'd asked for her number. And by the end of the month he'd introduced her to his mother. Sylvie would come to understand later that this was the first warning she missed. Heloise Whitmore received her in the sitting room of the family home in Rosedale, with the particular grace of a woman who has decided to tolerate something. She poured tea. She asked about Sylvie's family in Sudbury. The word Sudbury in Heloise Whitmore's mouth had a barely perceptible quality, not quite distaste, not quite pity, something more refined than either. And Sylvie had felt it land on her skin like a fine cold mist. But Garrett had reached over and taken her hand at exactly that moment, right there at his mother's tea table, and Sylvie had thought, he sees me, he chooses me, and that had seemed like enough. She married him the following October. The wedding was at the Whitmore family's property in Muskoka. There were 240 guests, most of them people Sylvie had never met, and a photographer who cost more than her first year's salary. Her mother came up from Sudbury in a dress she'd bought on sale at the Bay, and cried through the whole ceremony. And Sylvie had loved her so much in that moment that her chest ached with it. The morning after the wedding, Heloise Whitmore told Sylvie that she thought the flower arrangements had been a bit much. It was the beginning of a very long education. The Whitmores were in construction, commercial, mostly, with some residential development on the side. Garrett's grandfather had built the company from a two-man operation in the 1960s into something that had shaped the physical face of 3 Ontario cities. By the time Sylvie married into the family, Whitmore Group had 63 full-time employees, a portfolio worth close to $90 million, and the kind of reputation that meant their projects rarely ran into opposition from municipal planners. Sylvie spent the first 2 years of her marriage doing what wives in that world were expected to do: attending events, supporting Garrett's networking, organizing the household, learning which people to remember and which ones to merely be pleasant toward. She did not find it demeaning, exactly. She approached it the way she'd approached everything, as something to be learned, and learned well. But she was also quietly getting restless. It was Garrett himself who suggested she come work at the company. His development director had just left for a competitor, and Garrett said, only half joking at first, that she'd probably do the job better than anyone he could hire anyway. She'd laughed. He hadn't been entirely joking. Within the years she was managing donor relations for the foundation arm of Whitmore Group, the charitable side that funded community projects and earned the family goodwill across the city. Within 3 years she'd grown that portfolio by 40%, built relationships with 3 major municipal partners, and restructured the grant application process so efficiently that the administrative overhead dropped by 1/3. Heloise Whitmore never once acknowledged any of this directly, but she began during this period to stop referring to Sylvie as Garrett's wife when introducing her at events. She started saying Sylvie instead. Sylvie had counted this as progress. She could see now, extraordinarily good at finding progress where there was mostly just the appearance of it. The cracks in the marriage didn't announce themselves. They spread the way cracks in a foundation. Slowly, invisibly. Until the day something shifts and suddenly they're everywhere and you understand that they've been everywhere for a long time. Garrett started working later. Not every night but often enough that the pattern became the pattern. He stopped asking about her projects. He cancelled plans. Dinners they'd made months in advance. A trip to Portugal they'd talked about for 2 years. And when she raised it, he was apologetic enough that there was nothing specific to hold on to. He wasn't cruel, he was just absent in the way that can be almost harder to name. She brought it up twice. Both times he said he knew, he was sorry, work was a lot right now, and he loved her. Both times she believed him enough to let it go. The third time she tried to bring it up, he got frustrated. Not angry. Garrett rarely got angry outright, but he got that look, the one that said she was asking too much. Being too much. I'm trying to build something here, Sylvie, he'd said, gesturing vaguely at the air around them, which she understood to mean the company, the life, the reputation. As if she were not part of all of that. As if she hadn't been the one keeping the foundation relationships intact. While he attended golf tournaments and dinners, with people who didn't know a thing about what Whitmore Group actually did. She stopped bringing it up after that. She folded the grief neatly and put it somewhere internal. The way she'd learned to do with things she couldn't resolve right away. And she told herself that marriages went through seasons. That this was a season. Claudette Abruzzo, she learned eventually, worked at the architectural firm that handled most of Whitmore Group's design contracts. She was 31. Which Sylvie had thought about more than she wanted to admit. And she was exactly the kind of beautiful that photographs, well, which she also thought about more than she wanted to admit. She had been seeing Garrett for at least 11 months by the time of the anniversary dinner at Maison Laurent, possibly longer. How did Sylvie know 11 months? Because she found the first restaurant receipt in his jacket pocket. A place in Yorkville that she recognized because she'd been there once, years ago, for a work lunch and thought it was lovely. That had been in February. She'd said nothing and started paying closer attention. She built the picture slowly, the way she built everything. Without dramatics. Without confronting him before she understood the whole shape of it. By the night of their anniversary dinner, she knew quite a lot. What she had not known. What she genuinely had not seen coming, even with everything she'd learned, was that Garrett would bring Claudette Abruzzo to that dinner. To Maison Laurent. On their anniversary. With his mother and his uncle and his cousins all seated there as though this were an entirely normal arrangement. She thought about it afterward in the weeks that followed, and she kept arriving at the same conclusion. He had wanted her to explode. He had wanted a scene. She didn't know if he wanted it as an exit. Some way to end things that he could narrate as her fault, her instability, her inability to be reasonable, or whether he simply wanted to feel for once like something was happening, after months of the slow drift. But he had staged it, she was certain of that. You don't bring your girlfriend to your anniversary dinner at the restaurant you've booked every year for 12 years, without understanding what you're doing. The thing was, Sylvie Marchand had spent her entire life refusing to be the kind of woman who could be maneuvered. She had grown up with very little. She had made herself, carefully and without help, into someone with a great deal. She had survived Heloise Whitmore's sitting room, and the unspoken calculations of Rosedale, and the 1,000 small moments when the people in Garrett's world had looked at her and seen someone who was not quite enough. She had survived all of that by being absolutely certain, in the deepest part of herself, that she knew her own value. And she was not going to give Garrett Whitmore the satisfaction of a scene. So she had said thank you for dinner, and she had walked out, and she had driven herself home in the Volvo. Her Volvo, she'd bought it herself, and she had sat in the driveway for a while in the dark, and then she had gone inside and begun to make a list. Sylvie made lists the way some people made prayers. Specific, ordered, purposeful. This list was longer than most. She called her lawyer Francine the following morning. Francine was a family law specialist who also happened to be one of the sharpest people Sylvie had ever met, a fact she was now deeply grateful for. They had coffee at Francine's office downtown, and Sylvie laid out what she knew, the timeline, the receipts she'd photographed, the records she'd quietly assembled, and Francine had looked at her with something that was not quite surprise, and not quite admiration, but was somewhere between the two. You've been preparing, Francine said. I've been paying attention, Sylvie said. There's a difference. They spoke for 2 hours. When Sylvie left, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. The specific clarity that comes when a decision has been made and the path forward is, if not easy, at least visible. She did not call Garrett that day. He called her twice and she let both calls go to voicemail. She was not ready to have that conversation yet, and she had learned from years of negotiating grant partnerships and managing the particular politics of the Whitmore family, that you do not have the important conversation until you are prepared to have it fully. When she finally did speak to him, 3 days later she was calm. He was not. He had moved through apology and explanation and back to something that was almost strangely accusatory, as if her composure at the dinner was itself a kind of wrongdoing. As if she owed him a reaction. "You didn't even ask me about it," he said. "You just left. What would you have liked me to say, Garrett?" He didn't answer that. There was nothing to answer. "The lawyers will be in touch," she said. "I'd like this to be as civil as possible. I think we both would." She heard him exhale on the other end of the line. A long complicated sound, relief, maybe, or something that needed to be relief but wasn't quite. "Sylvie," he said, and she waited, and then he said, "I'm sorry, I actually am." "I know you are," she said, and she did. She believed that part. She simply understood by now that sorry was not the same as different. The weeks that followed were in certain ways the hardest she had navigated since she'd arrived at Western at 18, with 2 suitcases and a terror she refused to indulge. The Whitmore family had opinions, which they expressed through channels. Through Heloise's pointed silence when Sylvie stopped attending Sunday dinners. Through Spencer's awkward text asking if they could talk. Through Raymond's assistant reaching out to request a meeting that Sylvie declined politely and did not reschedule. She understood what they were doing. The Whitmore Group Foundation work, the relationships she had built and the reputation she had cultivated over a decade, was not something they wanted to lose. She had known this before she made any decisions. She had factored it in. She was good at factoring things in. She had a conversation with the foundation's board chair, a woman named Patricia Gould who had known Sylvie since she'd first taken the job. Sylvie was honest with her. She would be stepping back from her role, effective at the end of the quarter. The transition plan was ready. The key relationships had been documented. The ongoing projects were in order. Patricia had looked at her across the boardroom table with an expression that said she had suspected something like this was coming. "The foundation won't be the same without you," she said. "It will be fine," Sylvie said. "I made sure of that." And she had. She had, with a care and thoroughness that she knew bordered on the excessive, documented every relationship, prepared every handoff, written detailed notes on every partner and funder and community contact she had cultivated over the years. She owed the work that much. She didn't owe the Whitmore family an easy exit, but she owed the work. That was the distinction she kept returning to, in the quiet of the evenings. In the house that was starting to feel like something she was simply moving through. The work was real. The relationships were real. The community partners who relied on those grants, they were real. Garrett's pride, Heloise's preferences, Spencer's awkward texts, those were something else entirely. It was during this period that Sylvie heard from people she hadn't expected to hear from. The director of a youth mentorship organization she'd secured funding for sent her a handwritten note. A city planner she'd worked with on 3 consecutive projects called to check in and said, without her asking, that if she was ever looking for something new, he knew some people who would be grateful for a call. A woman named June, who ran an affordable housing advocacy nonprofit, and who Sylvie had always considered more of a professional acquaintance than a friend, invited her for lunch and showed up with a very specific and kindly offered piece of advice. The Ontario Trillium Foundation was looking for a new director of community investment, and June was on the search committee. Sylvie had taken the lunch and listened and thought about it for 2 days before she called June back and said yes, she was interested. She did not tell Garrett about any of this. He would find out eventually. He would find out when he found out. The divorce itself was not in the end dramatic. Francine was good at her job and Garrett's lawyer was competent, and neither Sylvie nor Garrett was the kind of person who needed destruction to feel like they'd won. She would leave the Rosedale house. She had never entirely thought of it as hers anyway. She would take what was hers. Her investments, the Volvo, the things that were actually hers. The financial settlement was fair. She had not gone looking for punishment. She had gone looking for clarity, and she found it. The paperwork was signed on a gray Tuesday morning in Francine's office. She and Garrett sat on opposite sides of a table and signed their names several times and did not make much eye contact. And when it was done, Sylvie stood and put on her coat and said, "I hope you're happy, Garrett, I mean that genuinely." And she had. He'd nodded. He'd looked, she thought, tired in a way he hadn't been before. She didn't allow herself to feel too much about that. She had spent a long time feeling things about Garrett Whitmore that he hadn't earned and wasn't going to give back. There were things she only learned later, through the particular grapevine of a world where everyone eventually runs into everyone. The Whitmore Group had lost 2 major municipal contracts in the 8 months following her departure. Not directly because of her, Sylvie told herself, and mostly believed it. But the foundation relationships had been more load-bearing than anyone had properly appreciated while she was maintaining them. And without that goodwill, without the community presence she'd built, the company's reputation in certain rooms had quietly eroded. Heloise, she heard, had been furious. Had blamed everyone in sequence. Garrett, then Claudette, then the board, then some unnamed enemy she'd apparently decided was responsible for the family's difficulties. Sylvie had heard this and felt nothing much at all. She had known Hellice long enough to know that accountability was not in the woman's vocabulary. Garrett and Claudette were still together, as far as she knew. She thought about this less than she expected to. There was a particular freedom she discovered in being done, fully and actually done, with something you'd been halfway done with for a long time. The grief was real and she didn't try to rush it. She let herself feel it on its own schedule, in the evenings mostly, sometimes with a glass of wine and sometimes without. And she didn't pretend it wasn't grief just because she'd been the one to leave. Blythe sent her a text, about 6 months after everything had concluded, that said only, "I always thought you were the best of us. I'm sorry it took me this long to say it." Sylvie had sat with that for a while. She had eventually written back, "Thank you, take care of yourself." She meant it. She always meant things. Spencer, as far as she knew, had not said anything. This also tracked. She started her new role in January, on the coldest week of the year, when the city was locked under a particular kind of Toronto cold that turns the light silver and makes everything look like a photograph of itself. She drove herself to the office on Yonge Street. She wore her good coat. She walked in and shook hands with people who would become colleagues and eventually friends. And she sat in her new office and looked out the window at the street below. The pedestrians hunched against the wind. The steam rising from somewhere underground. The city being exactly the city. And she thought about who she had been when she arrived in this city at 22, with a degree and a hunger she couldn't name yet. She had wanted so badly back then to be chosen. To have someone look at her and see the thing she saw in herself. It had taken her a long time to understand that the wanting itself wasn't the problem. That wanting to be seen is human, is real. But that she had spent too many years directing that want outward, toward people and institutions that were never going to be able to give her the thing she was looking for. Because the thing she was looking for was not something anyone else could give. It was something that had been hers the whole time. She had simply spent a decade leasing it to a family that had never understood what they had. She thought about the night at Maison Laurent sometimes. She thought about the specific quality of the silence she'd left behind. And sometimes, not always but sometimes, she allowed herself to think that it was one of the best moments of her life. Not because she had won something, not because Garrett had lost something, but because she had chosen in that moment who she was. She had walked out of that room as herself, and she had not looked back, and everything that had happened since had flowed from that. She opened her laptop. She read through her agenda for the day. She had a call at 9 with a regional funder, a site visit at 11 to a community kitchen project in Scarborough, a team meeting, the real work, her work. Outside the window the city went on being itself in the silver cold. She picked up her coffee and began.